I will hand it over to Danny.
Okay, thank you very much for allowing me to come and do this today. I had planned a series of 3 teach-ins, very brilliantly called When Karl Marx Was 18, that I was exactly going to do in August of this year, and then the Philly chapter was canceled. You know what I mean in terms of socially speaking. So this is one of them. I was going to kind of give the milieu of when Marx was 18, 2 18-year-olds on campus, and say what kind of world was it in. So this is one of them. This is more about the kind of French communism and really the theory of class struggle that Marx and Engels receive, also vis-a-vis someone like Auguste Blanqui. So I'm going to do the cliche thing. I'm going to start off with a quote. So this is from the preface to A History of Political Economy in 1837. I won't say who it is yet. In all the revolutions, there have always been but 2 parties opposing each other. That of the people who wish to live by their own labor, and that of those who would live by the labor of others. These 2 classes dispute with each other the powers and the honors only in order to repose in the beatific region where the conquering party never lets the conquered sleep in tranquility. Patricians and plebeians, slaves and freemen, Guwels and Ghibellines, I'm going to mispronounce that wrong, somebody will correct me on YouTube. Gallus, okay. Gallus. I was like Googling how do I pronounce this today. I know what it's about, just not how to pronounce it. Red roses and white roses, cavaliers and roundheads, liberals and serviles, are only varieties of the same species. The question that divides them is always that of their well-being, each one wishing, if I may be permitted a common expression, to draw the coverlid over himself at the risk of uncovering his neighbor. So in one country, it is through taxes that the fruit of the laborer's toil is wrested from him, another pretense of the good of the state. In another, it is by privileges, declaring labor a royal concession and making one pay dearly for the right to devote himself to it. The same abuse is reproduced under more indirect, but no less oppressive forms, when by means of custom duties, the state shares with the privileged industries the benefits of the taxes imposed on all those who are not privileged. So just for a little trivia, does anybody happen to know who that might be? Because now and then it's kind of brought up.
Tocqueville?
That's a good guess. And he's, in a lot of ways, as I'm going to talk about, is just simply saying the common view at the time. That is written in 1837, so that is 11 years before the Communist Manifesto. Marx is like 18, 19 at the time. I don't know exactly when this was penned. But that was written by Jerome Adolphe Blanqui, so the older brother of Auguste Blanqui, who I will be talking about today. And probably by the time he wrote that, many people in France would have been like, yeah, this is like past, cliche basically. Like plenty of people have already written this. I even put some of their names on the board. Marx himself in 1852 wrote to Joseph Weidemeyer that the democratic men, I think he's talking about the Chartists in this letter, should study the historical works of Thierry, Guizot, John Wade, unfortunately I'm not going to talk about him today, but he's very interesting, and so forth, in order to enlighten themselves as to the past history of the classes. The summoning of the Estates General in 1789 is regularly cited as the prelude to the outbreak of the French Revolution. The meeting of the 3 estates, the first estate, the clergy, the second estate, the nobility, and the third estate, the people, was called to discuss the financings of debt. The French participation in the American Revolution had triggered the French budget crisis. That is, the American Revolution was straightforwardly a catalyst for the French Revolution. For Adam Smith, the contest in America, as he puts it in Wealth of Nations, was itself a symptom of the far-reaching effects of the bourgeois revolution. The American Revolution was really nothing more than a fallback position. The legacy of the English Revolution stuck with the American revolutionaries. Benjamin Franklin had referred to himself as a Briton at the time of the 7 Years' War. Indeed, even on the eve of the American Revolution, Thomas Jefferson defended the rights of British America by saying that the property that was in the Americas was the alloidal property that was never converted to feudal property because, to quote Jefferson, America was not conquered by William the Norman, nor its land surrendered to him or any of his successors. For John Locke, the lineages of Adam and Eve, if they had ever existed, had been intermixed in practice by the emerging commercial society. The uncommonly read First Treatise of Government by John Locke was an attack on the justification for the divine right of land. So, you would point to the heavens and say, that's why I have this land. In other words, bourgeois society had practically overthrown the feudal basis. The slightly more sophisticated argument was that the hereditary nobility was transferred to the descendants of the conquerors. But even this could be challenged. Abbé Sieyès, in his pamphlet written for the summoning of the estates, writes, "If the blood of the Franks, hardly worth more in its pristine separateness, is indistinguishable from the blood of the Gauls, and if the ancestors of the Third Estate are the fathers of the whole nation, can we not hope one day to see an end of that long drawn-out parricide proudly carried out every day by one class against all the others? Why should not reason and justice, which may one day be motives as strong as vanity, press the ranks of the privileged, moved by a new, more true, and more social interest to seek the rehabilitation within the order of the Third Estate?" These were the thoughts of bourgeois society. They were basically giving a people's history, to use this common phrase. A subaltern group that worked and lived on the basis of cooperation that had been conquered for centuries, if not a millennia, were all of a sudden making their case for their political representation. We tend to associate the political revolution with really what is the political finale, really the late effect. The reality of the new society was so great that even with its political defeat, it had already conquered. This is where we get the idea of being on the right side of history, as I hear every 5 seconds. The French Revolution, unfortunately, was simultaneously too early and too late. Too late to be a classical political revolution. This is most expressed by what is usually most praised today about the first French Revolution, the extension of universal suffrage, generally understood with the 1792 and later also the 1793 Constitution. But this ended in the Reign of Terror. For democracy was also too early and too late. Too late because modern bourgeois society had begun stressing its limits, although this was understood as a specific condition of the French situation at the time, but also too early because when it would be realized in the kind of stunning triumph of the 1848 revolution in a kind of farcical manner. There is a phrase today, class analysis. This is what people tell me I have to do all the time. Do class analysis. But actually, this is what the French historians had already done at the time of the Restoration. But before I talk about the French historians, actually, let me put one more name on the board down here, because this is kind of the mysterious figure. And for the recording, I'm not swinging the microphone and moving around and writing things as well. Somebody asked me about that on YouTube. Several of the historians of what would later be part of, I'm not going to pronounce the French, but it's the Society of the History of France that was founded by François Guizot in 1833, were influenced either directly or indirectly by Henri de Saint-Simon, who we like to just say is Saint-Simon the Socialist. And also they were part of another historian's Pléiade, I think that's how you pronounce it, or Pléiade, the group of 7, Jules Michelet. Who I'm not going to quite talk about. I'm really going to talk about these people today, who are a little bit older than him, but he kind of is consummating their take on history. Saint-Simon originated the law of development as one of theology to metaphysics and then to positivism. That should be familiar to everybody in this room who just read Comte 2 summers ago. His student, Auguste Comte, would take over Saint-Simon's law of development as his own discovery. Such a result was the consequence of the progress of industry because, quote, "For the progress of industry is the most positive of all." That's Saint-Simon. Prior to the progress of industry, theology had ruled and been considered, quote, "the source of all rights and duties, and revelation has been the science of good and evil." But now it would become possible through industry to take the ideas that have been established in inverse order and present supernatural beliefs as the crown of the social edifice instead of the base, if that sounds familiar. Also, please interrupt me if you have any questions or something, otherwise I'm going to be like just a train on this thing. Okay. Henceforth, the science of societies, says Saint-Simon, should be treated in the same way as all the other sciences, by employing no other means but reasoning and observation. For Saint-Simon, after the fall of Rome and the takeover of the Merovingian dynasty in the 5th century, this is the Franks and Gauls, the first thing they did for him, this is for Saint-Simon, not for him personally, was to establish a basic sovereignty, a kind of amalgamation of the different races into one group. And if you ever read Francois Guizot's gigantic 6-volume French history, which I recommend, it's on audiobook, that's what I've been doing in my last month, he just talks about all of the different French races that don't exist anymore. The introduction of Christianity at the time had also been sort of a kind of mystical recognition of the equality of all. At the time, in Saint-Simon's schema, the Franks were the productive class. They were the directors of industrial operations. Almost all land belonged to them. They were equally endowed with movable agricultural property, chief among which were the Gauls, so the Gauls were their property, their movable property, who were bound to the land and who thus constituted the most ready, important class of animals. So, again, traditional society. The Gauls were artisans, but at the time slaves. The expenses of the Crusades caused the Franks to sell their land to the Gauls, and with this, they brought also new demands for luxury. They saw silk in the East and everything like that, stimulating the production of the market. For Saint-Simon, this had separated the merchant class from the military class and actually allowed industry to progress to a new stage. The monarchy, in order to reestablish its power against the barons, united with the industrials, that's what he called them, Louis XI becoming the king of the Gauls rather than the king of the Franks. In Saint-Simon's words, the merchants, quote, wanted to become the first class in society. So Saint-Simon already has this view of the development of the forces of production, that the forces of production outstrip some kind of relations of production. I'm saying all of this because this is kind of commonly taught as Marxist view. And that likewise, there's some kind of progress of higher forms of relations allowing for new potentials. And like other utopian socialists, he was forward-looking. So as a young man, he fought in the American Revolution, so he's a fan of the American Revolution. And, like Robert Owen, he's constantly looking to America as some kind of future. The, quote, progress of enlightenment had always reduced government action more and more. And Saint-Simon was looking forward to the future progress where, quote, the role of authority in social life will in time be reduced to zero. So the withering away of the state. That is a Saint-Simon idea. Likewise, his followers after his death used to say to each other, to each according to his ability, to each according to his works. If that sounds familiar. Sounds familiar? Okay. People are shaking their heads in the room. All right.
Because Marx says each according to his need, ability to each according to his needs.
Yeah. And also Louis Blanqui as well. But again, these things are just in the history at the time.
So where are we in history right now?
At this time, we're kind of in 1800 up until, I forget the exact year that Saint-Simon dies, the 1820s or maybe early 1830s. But the reason I'm emphasizing Saint-Simon, as I'm going to go over into the next section, is because Saint-Simon has an influence on all of these French historians. So certainly we know Auguste Comte, who I've mentioned, but there's even more connections. It's like a whole spiraling tree. In the context of the Restoration, so this is when the Bourbons return, it's when the emigres return, the strategy of the liberals, so these are people that supported kind of the constituent assembly, so you can think from, I think the way they would put it is from Bastille up to August 10th, 1792, when the Girondins take over, so they're the ends of the French Revolution. The liberals sought to justify the revolution as necessary, right? That to be on the right side of the history, you have to recognize what was happening. This was especially spurred by the 1814 Charter, so this is why I put this on the board, which was written like a kind of compromise of the revolution with the king. And there are a variety of things that happened at the time. There was a kind of royalist liberal alliance, and then there were also like conservatives and ultras. And so the ultras wanted to actually go back prior to the charter. There were some conservatives who were like, we denounced the revolution, but it's opened a door that we can't put back. So again, the liberals are looking into history, and I'll start talking about them particularly, because they're trying to say, what is this political institution, and what is this revolution we just led through? Also in 1823, there's like a Civil War revolution in Spain, and that's kind of bringing up memories about the French Revolution. I forget the exact relationship of the Bourbon throne to the Spanish throne, but they're relatives because everybody was. But nonetheless, it's bringing up like, whose side are you on? France intervenes, right?
The Bourbons were the throne.
Were the throne.
One branch of the Bourbon family.
One branch. So they intervene, and I guess it's cousins, probably cousins, or brothers, or I don't know.
The politics get very complicated.
The politics get very
But
complicated.
it's kind of an inversion of what happens when Napoleon invades, because when Napoleon invades, it signals the beginning of revolutions across the Spanish Empire, which are going to be split along the lines of really how they orient towards the destruction of the monarchy and towards the French Revolution. So, for instance, in Chile, you have a pro-royalist revolution led by an Irishman named Eric O'Higgins, who wants to restore the Spanish crown against Napoleon. But then in Gran Colombia, you have the beginnings of the Bolivarian, what will become later the Bolivarian Revolution, and they're kind of, pro-Napoleon, anti-crown. So in the 1820s, it's very different. The French are coming to help restore, to put down the revolutionaries across not just Spain, but the Spanish Empire.
I see.
And people will liken even Napoleon III later in the 1860s when he goes and installs Maximilian in Mexico. A lot of the liberals and kind of the socialist-leaning people of that time will say, oh, this is just like in 1823.
Oh, interesting. So that's just a backdrop, and so that's kind of permeating the history, meaning there's a question about the French Revolution, and is this true or not, like true in the philosophical sense? Was that a crime? It's kind of playing out in these kind of proxy wars as well, and that's influencing everything. So because this reminded the liberals of 1789, there's this is an apparent fact written by Comte Baru, who was Stendhal's uncle. Yeah, estimated that almost 40 million pages of history were printed in 1825 alone. But even in 1811, there was 3 million pages of history. And again, I'm sure my French is not good. That's fine. Okay, so why did I talk about Saint-Simon? Because Saint-Simon's adopted son, in his own words, was Augustin Thierry, who I'm really going to focus on today, who Karl Marx is later going to call the father of the class struggle. So Thierry and Saint-Simon had written a treatise in 1814 on the reorganization of Europe in the wake of the Napoleonic Wars. That it contained within it a lot of kind of Saint-Simonian ideas. I should say as well, this kind of idea behind the new Christianity was actually Saint-Simon saying Christianity played a role. We need a new Christianity because, in fact, the development of society has required a new religion. That's why he was talking about the inverse. But he basically, Saint-Simon Thierry wanted to have a parliamentary system modeled on England, and then kind of famously or infamously with industrialists and scientists sort of leading the nations. And it's very, meaningful why Saint-Simon says he kind of speaks to the industrialists and scientists, because he's saying this revolution we've kind of lived through, it's kind of somewhat your effect. Even if you're the minority, you're the ones who brought these ideas into existence. Thierry broke with Saint-Simon, unfortunately, and then he was replaced by Auguste Comte as the secretary of Saint-Simon. So there's a direct lineage of all these people around each other. As Thierry would put it, in 1817, preoccupied with a strong desire to contribute to the triumph of constitutional opinions, I began to look into the work of history for proofs and arguments which would support my beliefs. Thierry felt that the history of France had not only been yet to be written, but was being suppressed during the Restoration. So he kind of drew an analogy to the English Revolution. Human opinion is often unfaithful to the cause of humanity. In the presence of the victorious chief of a revolution, when the field of battle is cleared, when the victor is the only man displaying himself, the remembrance of this great defeat is reduced in our minds to a few deceived hopes, a few convictions belie, a few vanished shimmerings. Our interest, which always requires to be excited by some perceptible being, is easily lost on metaphysical subjects, and for want of food is bestowed on the success of the conqueror, on the success of our own enemy. We rejoice in his joy. We join our voice to the acclamations which proclaim our nothingness. Such is the fatal force of human feeling. The French have experienced it. That sounds like Walter Benjamin to me. In other words, how the defeat of the revolution is weighing on history. But Thierry could not accept this. Why not? There was something about reality that as he put it in his introduction to his famous historical studies, quote, "The situation of civilized men varies and renews itself incessantly. Every century that passes over a people leaves a different mode of life, different interests, different wants from what is found. But in the succession of different states, language does not change so rapidly as things, and it is rare that new facts meet at any given point with new signs which express them. The interests which have just arisen are forced to explain themselves in the idiom of those which have disappeared and are not properly understood. Present conditions are disguised beneath the expression given to former conditions and either deceive or escape observation. Truth is demanded of all who write on law, as if he who undertakes to speak to men about what they are and what they have to do had only to be truthful. But at every instant we are conquered by conventional formulas, and truth is buried beneath words." So for Thierry, words like sovereignty and government, or even the people, as Ultra would put it, Lamennais, he would say there was no people in ancient Rome. The people's a new concept. And so here Thierry is saying, well, the term people has always existed, but the people have changed. Were words that have been in use for the last 2,000 years, and yet have had the most varying conceptions. Quote, "There is nothing absolute for the human species, either in good or evil," Thierry proclaims. "A shipwrecked man thrown by the sea upon some desert coast exclaims that he is happy, yet he is naked and hungry. In the same way, a nation long restrained in the use of its faculties, finding itself suddenly more free, may proclaim that it is happy, which means nothing then except that its condition is more bearable." Consequently, for Thierry, people were frequently led to mistrust history because, quote, "too frequently the writer, instead of simply relating what passes before his eyes, represents to us what he imagines and substitutes his ideas for facts, or perverts facts by connecting them with other foreign facts. Anything could be proved with illusions. Frequently history," this is my favorite quote, "is nothing but one continuous he, and unfortunately, whilst writers turn it at their pleasure and make it a clothing for their thoughts, they present it to men as the true rule of action, as the instructress who teaches them how to live. It is because they know they are concealed behind it, and that in extolling history, it is truly their own cleverness which they are praising." So no wonder Hegel, in the introduction to the philosophy of history that all of us have read in this room several times and should read several times, says that the French historians have displayed great genius in reanimating bygone times and in bringing the past to bear upon the present condition of things. They have given us a history of history, a criticism of historical narratives, and an investigation of their truth and credibility. So this idea of history becoming historical is kind of impressing itself upon the French historians. So, but what are the stakes of this? Is it just like, oh, cool, there's new facts and things? No, this is for them to quote Stanley Mellon, who wrote it, The Political Uses of History, a great book on the French Restoration. The language of politics was the language of history during the Restoration. So Thierry continues, "Towards the end of the last century, we experienced a kind of uneasiness in our social state. By observing ourselves attentively, by interrogating our wants, we might have discovered whence the evil came and whence the remedy would come. But we never thought of this examination. We were, it was said, in a monarchy. We attacked the word. And then, instead of promising ourselves that our wants should be satisfied and our faculties have their liberty, we resolved, as our only project, to get rid of a monarchy. We then reasoned thus. Since a monarchy is very bad for us, the contrary of monarchy will be very good. Now, it is certain that a democracy is, in every respect, the reverse of monarchy. Therefore, we want a democracy. Scarcely were we settled into a democracy when we were astonished at being worse off. A second reasoning was obvious, and we did not fail to make it. If we get no good either by monarchy or democracy, which are two extremes, we must necessarily find it in a middle term, and in a system composed of these two systems. Full of confidence in the syllogism, we hastily organized a mixed system of democracy and monarchy. We soon felt its effect. Thus, the effort of our revolution was made for vain formulas and almost for a quibble. The sensible, the real interest remained forgotten. So he's pointing towards the productive character of society, right? That, again, he's a student of Saint-Simon. Thierry is alluding to the collapse of the First Republic, specifically the confusion between ancient and modern liberty. If this reminds one of Benjamin Constant's The Liberty of Ancients compared with that of the moderns, know that these very words I just read were first drafted in, I apologize for this, Censure European, in the same period. So a variety of people are saying a similar thing at this time. Madame de Stael is saying this the same in her considerations. Thus Thierry asks, were we of the same nature as those ancient nations? And if so, was it really owing to the social machine in which they were employed as materials that their well-being resulted? One cry arises from all antiquity. Democracy is the life of society. Apart from democracy, the civilized man vegetates and becomes extinct. This unanimous consent, the little figure which has been made in these days by those who could not say, we are members of the sovereignty, all these have led us to regard the discipline of the Romans and the Spartans as a sort of law of human nature, the violation of which was followed by an infallible misfortune. All that we desired, all that we wanted, we expected from this discipline. We revived all of the rules, all the forms. We laid them down for ourselves. We declared them our imprescriptible right to conquer our degenerated nature, which submitted with difficulty to these strange practices. We decreed the most terrible sentences against ourselves, democracy or death. But what pleased the men of antiquity was the full and free exercise of their active faculties. If they loved their democracy, it was because it favored this exercise. The faculties and inclinations of those men were far from having any similarity to ours. In circumstances in which their disposition excited them to action, ours demands repose. There, where they did not like to act, activity is necessary for us. Therefore, we require to be free in our actions, in which they could bear constraint, and we can bear constraint where they could not bear to be curbed. Therefore, their rules of right and wrong, of privileges and duties, their laws of command and prohibition, ought to have been reversed to be applicable to us. Peace and industry were indicted to them, and they bore it willingly. Perhaps we should be willing for war to be indicted to us. The prohibition to emigrate did not trouble them. They wished to be attached to their native land. We require our steps to be free. For them, independence existed only within the limits of their country. Out of it were slavery and enemies, whilst with us, oppression may come from our neighbors, and liberty from elsewhere. For us, there are friends as well as enemies everywhere. Let a city take all its inhabitants and make them fractions of itself. Reduce a man who can act personally to the state of a passive member of a body which moves, animates, and destroys him at will. If this nullity of existence is not the only state in which he can live, it will be the state in which he will live least. If disposing of what I possess and regulating its quantity and use, these are property rights, is not the sole means of preserving it for me, it is an encroachment to my existence. To imagine that it is rendering these regulations more supportable by leaving to each one the power of decreeing them against others by decreeing them against himself is the most absurd folly, unless in times when despotism is more attractive to men than prosperity. He's sort of alluding to like 1792, 1793. It was no doubt useful to remind us that formerly when, in the name of the state, men were disturbed in the enjoyment of their private life, it was not the welfare of a few families, but a social necessity, which demanded privation and constraint. But at the same time, the wants of our present nature ought to have been recognized. Restraints which the ancients bore as the lesser evil should not have been inflicted on us. So many in France, this is sort of Thierry's strategy, looked to England to make sense of what was happening on the continent. So he kind of first writes these histories of England. Also Guizot writes these histories. I'll talk about him in a second. Madame de Stael wrote that, quote, the same movement in the minds of men which brought about the revolution in England was the cause of that in France in 1789. Both belong to the third era in the progress of social order, the establishment of representative government. Thierry took her advice and looked to England to make sense of what was... Go ahead, yeah.
Which revolution is it referred to? The 1688 or 1649?
That's a good question. I imagine she might say the later one. You know? I don't know, because the reason I say that is Thierry has these histories also of 1640, and it is one of these things where Cromwell is depicted as a bad guy by Thierry, but he also says, Thierry also is not quite a fan of 1688, 1689, that he says the people took in a kind of passive sense, and that it was more like intrigues between like the opposition and things like that. That's my, actually, for the record, I don't know what Madame de Staël, I think that's what she means.
I think so too.
Yeah.
That was the revolution of compromise, of different classes learning to live with one another.
But Thierry,
it would have been,
go ahead, yeah.
I mean, it would have been taking up, I think, the development, not just of 1649, but of like the 1630s when you have the establishment of habeas corpus, the Bill of Rights. You know, the idea that even in 1688, most of these people, I think, were defenders, you know, despite the compromise of the right of Parliament to execute the king. The idea that the king is authorized by the people, I think, develops out of the revolution of the 1640s, and you know, that is part of the foundation of the, you know, compromise, the glorious revolution of 1688.
I'll say,
Yes, but Puritanism would have been a really alien idea for the French in that.
Can I say something about this?
They thought that Protestantism would become the only religion if you had like freedom of religion. Madame de Staël and Constant thought that Protestantism, because it's the most enlightened, rational version of Christianity, would win in the end if you got rid of state.
But 1689 really is the enlightened revolution.
The passage, the long passage I read about Thierry reflecting on like history and kind of the grief also with history, so that's how he starts off his historical study. And I think actually he's saying in 1689, the ends of 1640 are actually being buried as well. He doesn't present it in an illuminating light. He kind of presents it as just a compromise. And he's not saying the charter is the same thing. He's saying there's this subterranean revolution. That's Thierry. You can disagree with that, but that's what Thierry.
But it is the religion. It is the revolution of compromise. It instills compromise and balance.
But hold on one second about compromise, because of course there's like compromise, and then there's how they're going to talk about compromise, which they're going to deep down go into the roots of what that compromise is. I mean, there's a compromise as in if I just fight somebody and we fight to like a standoff, that's like a compromise. They're saying it's also a compromise reflecting civil society.
Yeah, so 1689 is the revolution of balance, of moderation, of rejection of the religious enthusiasm of the 1640s, and so that just sounds like a lot closer to French liberalism of the 1820s.
That could be, and in Thierry's history, there are a variety of times, even though he's going to talk about the bourgeoisie as his fathers, like there's like this really strong link. I love Thierry's like history. I mean, Guizot's interesting, but Thierry's like very well, like writing very well. But he will say, oh, the bourgeoisie in the past have made bad moves. So who am I thinking of? Marcel, like around the time of the 100 Years' War, like the burghers then. That he's saying, oh, it's around the convocation of the first States General.
That was the wars of religion. 1614?
No, way before that, 14th century. I have his name written down. Let me get to it. Etienne Marcel. Right? Yeah, go ahead.
Can I just add one thing about the English history? Because in this period, you have the liberals in England are actually making a similar move, and they're writing histories of party. And they make an almost identical argument to Thierry's argument, which is that what the development of the Whig Party was, you know, the kind of development of the limitation of the authority and power of the state to coerce people in their private life. And that, you know, for them, like, even the Glorious Revolution fulfilled the ideals of both Cromwell and Milton, that the people would ask and invite back the king. right? And that would mean, the subordination of the king. And this is why they have to kill the king. Like, the reason Charles I is killed is because they do invite him back. They want him to come back, but they want him to come back as an executive who is subordinated to the will of the people in Parliament, right? So he's not just the king in Parliament, he's the king who works for Parliament and works for the people. And Charles I was like, well, then I wouldn't be the king anymore, and so he was going to organize all sorts of people to put down the revolution. Yep. So what's developed out of this is really the first bourgeois political party, yep, which is the Whigs. And the Whigs are supposed to be oppositional to the power of the king and to the power of the old aristocracy, and they are the ones who are going to go and represent society, basically, against these different forms of authority. So that's like the person who writes that, I forget his name, it's in Herbert Spencer talks about it. It's called Dissertation on Parties, but it's from 1820, it's from the same time as this. So the liberals are kind of, rediscovering that history of the bourgeois revolution and its political form, and they're like, this created, the Whig Party is what developed and created the form of representative government that we have today, and the division of powers, right? So I think that idea would have been held by these people, and so I don't know that they would have seen 1688 simply as a compromise. They would have said, well, if you're inviting the king back on your own terms, then he's no longer the king the way that he was.
Someone like Guizot, who I keep dropping his name, and I haven't really introduced him yet, especially in his theory of history, where he kind of has this thing where Europe has been an admixture of, as he calls it, monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy, that basically history has been an ever-combining change in these kind of factors as well. And now and then he throws in Christianity. So rather than being presented as a compromise, and I'll get to this because also I'll talk about Blanqui later, right? So this history that's kind of in the young Blanqui's, zeitgeist, they're sort of pushing on it in a kind of way. But let me just keep going, because the reason I bring that up is that everything Aaron said is right, and in a sense, maybe the history of class struggles is before this even, and yet there's something about what the French are doing that when Thierry, as I'm about to talk about, gives his history of England, he draws on Hume's history of England, but he's reading it in a certain way, right? He kind of gives a narrative out of these other histories of England. So Thierry avoided the conclusion of reducing the problem to a wise legislator, so you can't just put it at the level of a compromise. Quote, the English never had in view the design of dividing by generations the successive labors which were to complete their organization, finish their social condition, and bring to them the best system. They did not perceive that there were three essential elements which had to be combined without being confounded, namely monarchy, aristocracy, and democracy. It is not true that by a premeditated design, they reared over them a monarchy, and at the same time an aristocracy to oppose it, that they afterwards introduced a dose of democracy, which they increased little by little until it was on an equality with the other two principles, and symmetry was attained. These abstract speculations may delight a few thinkers by profession, but they occupy but little people who are more material in their interests. So again, he's linking it to what is changing in the very structure of society that is giving rise to these different parties that are representing these things. The solution to the question for both Francois Guizot and Thierry came about simply because they were asking the question. So again, if history is historical, the fact that they're asking this question means something has happened. So Guizot notes that the facts about which history concerns itself neither gain nor lose anything by being handed down from age to age. Whatever we have seen in these facts, and whatever we can see, has been contained in them ever since they were originally accomplished. But they never allow themselves to be fully apprehended, nor permit all their meaning to be thoroughly investigated. They have, so to speak, innumerable secrets, which slowly utter themselves after man has become prepared to recognize them. And as everything in man and around him changes, as the point of view from which he considers the facts of history and the state of mind which he brings to the survey continually vary, we may speak of the past as changing with the present. Unperceived facts reveal themselves in ancient facts. Other ideas, other feelings are called upon by the same names and the same narratives, and man thus learns that in the infinitude of space opened up to his knowledge, Everything remains constantly fresh and inexhaustible. It was for Guizot only those extraordinary crises, those revolutions, which, so to speak, entirely delocalize man and transport him to a different sphere. These revolutions for Guizot do not unfold themselves in an abrupt and sudden manner. They are conceived and nurtured in the womb of society long before they emerge in the light of day. Right? Meaning Guizot is going to go all the way back to the 5th century and say this has just been slowly brewing. But the moment arrives beyond which their full accomplishment cannot be delayed, and they then take possession of all that exists in society, transform it, and place everything in an entirely new position. So that if, after such a shock, man looks back upon the history of the past, he can scarcely recognize it. Guizot continues that the grand crises in the life of humanity are not all of the same nature. Although they sooner or later influence the whole mass of society, they act upon it and approach it in some respects from different sides. Sometimes it is by religious ideas, sometimes by political ideas, sometimes by a simple discovery or mechanical invention that the world is ruled in change. The apparent metamorphosis which the past then undergoes is effected chiefly in that which corresponds to the essential character of the revolution that is actually going forward to the present. Thus, the political movement of the Third Estate by Thierry and Guizot were justified as a result of a long development. This is how they were fighting back against the conservatives and the ultras. Political institutions were considered the result of the development of production. Guizot writes, "To understand political institutions, one should know the diverse social conditions and the relations between them. To understand the diverse social conditions, one should know the nature of property relations." So again, his history is the transformation in property relations. I'll just say Saint-Simon claims he influenced Guizot, but we know that at least Thierry and him were like friends, so all of this is kind of percolating through them. Religion, too, for Thierry was considered just the superstructure of economic interest. So when he's writing about the English, he says, "It was for positive interest that the war was waged by both sides. All the rest were merely extraneous or a pretext. Most of those who took up the cause of the subjects were Presbyterians, that is, wanted no yoke, even in religion. Those who supported the opposite cause were Episcopalians or Papists. Even in the field of religion, they were out to exercise power and impose taxes." So Thierry begins kind of at the end of the 18 teens with his study of England. He describes the Norman conquest as a kind of struggle between classes of men and their opposite, so between the conquered and the conquest. The onerousness of administering the conquered blows over into the First Barons' War, where basically the mass of people still as a kind of multitude are kind of called upon in the First Barons' War, just obviously as foot soldiers and as political actors. And this leads to the Magna Carta. And, again, Thierry kind of describes the officers. These were the ones that were administering the duties as landowners. So he's giving them a kind of more modern view. But also for Thierry, it reorganized aristocratic and monarchical relations. So the king, in response to the Magna Carta, then gives liberty to the merchants. He gives liberty to certain people to not be taxed and to have movable property kind of over and against the barons, kind of as a way to get back at them. The House of Commons, which has a kind of longer history, slowly emerges over time for Thierry as kind of, again, he's giving like an analogy to the Estates General. That originally it's just kind of starting as getting tributes off of people, and then as their third estate, I guess they don't have a third estate, their bourgeoisie are developing, they slowly are able to become more recalcitrant towards the king. When the king would go to war and would ask for a loan, one of the first things they would demand is that, no, we're not going to give you a loan unless you at least answer our petition. So it started to become a kind of means of communication between the king and the bourgeoisie. As the burghers became more strong, they became, a little bit more recalcitrant. Sir Thomas More, the kind of famous early utopian socialist, in 1509 opposes the king's demand for money in the House of Commons. Just, we're not giving it to you. They began to challenge the property claims over time, meaning it used to be like, why do you have this property? Oh, my great-great-great-great uncle was fought in the army with William the Bastard. And then over time it was more like, well, it was ordained by God, that's why we were able, or they would just point to the heavens. But once you introduce Christianity, then people start to make the argument, well, aren't we all equal? Aren't we all children of God? So again, the comments are kind of feeling their strength. But what's important for Thierry as well, just to jump ahead a little bit, is that for him, we should not imagine, where's this quote? Oh yeah, this is a good one. This is a good one. We should not imagine that there was a nation at the time in England. As he put it, at the time of the Norman conquest, it was only an encamped nation, a nation of strangers. The natives had nothing but their misery in common. Each one apart served his master. He did nothing for his equals, who did nothing for him. It was a scattered multitude. Industry united them by mutual services rendered. Industry inspired them with the desire of their common liberty. So again, he's very specifically drawing on his teacher, Saint-Simon, right here. By tracing the true history of modern society to the development of the civil state, the Restoration-era historians were attempting to preserve the bourgeois revolutions despite the political counter-revolution. In particular, and this goes to what we were just talking about, the very structure of the political institutions was to be understood as an outcome of the political structure of different social interests, right? In a way that maybe one couldn't quite say the same prior to this. So Francois Guizot, in his General History of Europe, actually this might be from another text, all the forms and principles of social organization are in Europe coexistent. He's comparing it to Asia and Egypt, where he says there's just one dominant principle. Spiritual and temporal powers, theocratical, monarchical, aristocratical, democratical elements, all classes and all the social arrangements are mingled and pressing on each other. There are extreme degrees as to the liberty, wealth, and influence. And these different powers are in a state of continual strife amongst themselves without anyone succeeding in stifling the others and in taking sole possession of society. Let me just stop for a second. Guizot's own philosophy of history itself implies the continual development of things, right? He just kind of presents history. It's a very common thing Marx and Engels are going to do with people in the 1820s, that their own theories are constantly begetting the transformation of all that's existing in a way that maybe was not the case. In the olden times, all societies seem at every great epoch to have been cast in the same mold. It is sometimes pure monarchy, sometimes theocracy or democracy which prevails, but each completely lords in its turn. Modern Europe presents examples of all the systems and theories of social organization. Pure or mixed monarchies, theocracies, republics, more or less aristocratic, exist there simultaneously side by side, notwithstanding their diversity. They all have a certain resemblance, a certain family aspect which it is impossible to overlook. In the ideas and sentiments of Europe, there is the same variety, the same combat. The theocratical, monarchical, aristocratical, and popular creeds encounter, struggle with, limit, and modify each other. So again, through kind of studying the, specifically the English situation, then Thierry returns to the French situation. And this is where it's starting to become a little bit more political about what just happened. Was this accidental? Thierry writes in 1818, "Who of us has not heard of a class of people in times when the barbarians were overrunning Europe, preserve the industrial arts and skills for humanity? Insulted and plundered daily by their victors and their masters, they lived in hardship, receiving for their labors only the consciousness of doing good and preserving civilization for the children of the world. These saviors of our arts were our fathers. We are the sons of those serfs, those tributaries, those bourgeois that the conquerors preyed upon without mercy. It is to them that we owe everything that we are. But we, the liberated slaves of yesterday, have so long preserved in our memories only the families and the actions of our masters. It was only 30 years ago that we bethought ourselves," so he's talking about 1788, 89, "of our fathers having been the nation. We only started to think they were even French. We admired and studied everything except what they were and what they did. We are patriots and have committed to oblivion all those who for 14 centuries tilled the soil of our motherland, which was so devastated by other hands. In the history of the Third Estate, so I'm going to summarize just long things about Thierry, he basically presents labor as saving human civilization, right? So kind of after the decline of the Roman Empire, the declension, and then kind of the invasion by the barbarians, there's this kind of period, I've already went over it a little bit because he's kind of taking Saint-Simon's history of something like a Caesar papawism, the kind of admixture of different races. There's some kind of early absolute monarchy. There's, as Saint-Simon was saying, the property was in kind of almost chattel slaves. But what was introduced at the time for Thierry, unlike ancient Rome, were two things. One, Christianity, more specifically, okay, we're all equal in the eyes of God. But actually, and this is a very curious thing, and this is why for Thierry we can't go back to ancient Rome, he's like, the barbarians introduced individuality into human civilization in a way that was not there in Rome. So when he talks about the ancient republics, he says, man was of his own accord specifically attached to any other man. We were all bound to the city, right? So in a sense, there was an individuality in the way that actually the barbarians introduce it, and he kind of traces it through how first it's like personal bondage of chieftains, like warrior chiefs. And if you read Guizot's long history, you can hear about all these badass Gaulish, knights and stuff, like Brennus or something, sacking Greek temples or something like that. That they're kind of subsisting on very direct connection with their fellow tribe. And that eventually is developing, obviously, into the vassalage and the personal kind of, feudal bondage that we're more familiar with, that Marx and Engels talk about being wiped out with the bourgeois revolution. But that's actually introducing a kind of element into society. Now, eventually there's a kind of conflict, this goes back to Guizot and Thierry, between the king and the lords, the officers, the aristocrats that tended to break things up. This is kind of the development of feudalism. And for Thierry, while labor had been preserved by the priests, who in early Christianity were connected to the people, right? They were being directly voted, and even people were voting on what kind of religious doctrines to adopt in their communes, and they were kind of directly voting on things. Eventually, the clergy kind of become a temporal power, to use this nice euphemism, and separate themselves from the people. And what's happening in the cities is, as he puts it, the kind of restoration and rehabilitation of the ancient Roman law on the basis of labor. So there's this idea that bourgeois right is actually saving human civilization because it's allowing old ancient Roman law to come back, meaning obviously there were already Roman decrees about property and things, but it's allowing it to be on the basis of human rights, meaning it's being admixed with Christianity, with equality of all men, that the bourgeoisie are taking over from the feudal lords the castle, right? Meaning they're kind of seeing those badass castles and they're like, well, this is how we can fortify these cities to defend ourselves. And likewise, between the king and the feudal lords, they're able to supersede the wants of both of them. Meaning the feudal lords are kind of sitting on the principle of sovereignty, and in the castles, in the modern castles, the cities, the burghers, are able to sit upon sovereignty because they're able to defend themselves. And as Thierry puts it, they assign to themselves the right of insurrection. He directly says that, the right to defend themselves. And furthermore, they're able to meet the demand of the king for absolute monarchy because the king is unable to control the lords. And we know the kind of common story about the king chartering the bourgeoisie against the lords. It's right there in the first sentence of that section in the Communist Manifesto. But actually what Thierry emphasizes is that labor is cooperative and disciplining, and that in a sense there's a resuscitation of the ancient Roman law on the basis of bourgeois right in the cities, which are allowing them to be disciplined to a sole authority in a way that was not quite possible in Rome, right? If you think about how Rome collapses into emperors, it's actually how Guizot starts his story going into the 5th century. Is he's taking all these petitions. It's amazing the historical work he did of Gaul like chieftains asking to be subject to a Roman emperor, and the Roman emperor saying no. Likewise with England. England is, modern Britannia is an abandoned colony. So you also have this kind of idea coming about. And furthermore, for Guizot, the church, not only did it give us religion, but it gave us a link, as it quotes, a link, the medium, the principle of civilization between the Roman and barbarian worlds. So in the 12th century, we start to get, as Thierry calls it, the crisis of the condition of the urban society. And this is what he sees as, he calls it a silent struggle, a kind of silent class struggle between the free municipality, so the claims that the growing burghers are making against basically representatives of the church, right? Like bishops and all sorts of Latin words I can't pronounce that stand for like the people who get to superattend and gather taxes for the church. Likewise with Guizot kind of following Saint-Simon, go ahead. With Guizot following Saint-Simon, feudalism had broken people up and had also given, Guizot actually quotes Thierry as saying he's the one who has the insight into the individuality that barbarians give to modern civilization. But likewise, he says even deeper than that, once you have these settled separate estates, it is actually then setting in motion the development of private property. And so you can read someone like Adam Smith talk about slowly over time, the corvée system and tenants, and how as people can have more of the fruits of their labor, they're becoming more industrious, things like that. So all of these things, Thierry and Guizot are looking at how that's changing the form of production and how that's then changing the politics and the organization of society. I should just say as well that unlike Saint-Simon, they're a little bit more settled about forces and relations to production. Saint-Simon is creating this idea that history moves through forces and relations. They kind of allow that to exist up until their present. And then it kind of stops there, right? So even though they say all of these things, they kind of don't allow it to go any further. But in 1818, Thierry says, an invisible and ever active power, labor spurred by industry, will precipitate at the same time all the population of Europe into this general movement. The productive force of the nations will break all its fetters. Industry will disarm power by the desertion of its satellites, who will find more profit in free and honest labor than in the profession of slaves guarding slaves. Industry will deprive power of its pretexts and excuses by recalling those the police keep in check to the enjoyments and virtues of labor. Industry will deprive power of its income by offering at less cost the services which power will make people pay for. And he goes on again and again and again that industry is basically creating this revolution, and it's rendering irrational the previous system of production. It's very Saint-Simonian, right? It's like what's being recognized as productive is transforming. Now, because of this, the parties that emerged in 1789 were not merely bickering over power. To quote Francois Mignet, so this is a historian of the French Revolution, also a friend of Thierry, they're all like in the circle, they're all talking to each other. Quote, the English Revolution had begun the era of new governments. The French Revolution not only modified the political power, but it entirely changed the internal existence of the nation. For these abuses, the revolution substituted a system more conformable with justice and better suited to our times. Previously, the king had played the third estate against the nobles and had contributed to its development. This is sort of how Mignet starts off his history. Likewise, the nobles at time had tried to use the estates general, say during, I'm going to mispronounce this, the Fronde. This is the word of the aristocrats with the king, but to no avail. Right, so again, it had been called in the 14th century, was called in 1614, the nobles try again, and it's like 1640s, I forget the year. Now, this is Mignet, after a century of absolute submission, it reappeared in the arena, but on its own account. The court was to have another antagonist, for it must always have one, power never being without a candidate. The third estate, which increased daily in strength, wealth, intelligence, and union, was destined to combat and to displace it. The king, for Mignet, had encouraged his own praise, but prepared way for his own blame. For everything then became the object of their researches and reflections, governments, religions, abuses, laws. They proclaimed rights, laid bare men's wants, denounced injustice. A strong and enlightened political opinion was formed, whose attacks the government underwent without venturing to attempt its suppression. For Mignet, I'm not going to talk too much about the French Revolution. The history of the French Revolution is basically succeeding parties that are representing different interests of society. Now, he is a liberal. He wants what we were talking about earlier, but he basically sees that from 1789 to then the Girondins, that's going to then the middle class. And so the party is representing the kind of middle class interest. And then the May 31st, 1793 insurrection is the party of, he calls it the multitude. So he's saying different social interests. Again, he's in the same milieu as them. The king, the aristocrats, the middle class are forming parties, and that those political parties are representing different social interests. Here's a good quote. In a new country after a revolution of independence, as in America, any constitution is possible. There is but one hostile party, that of the metropolis, and when that is overcome, the struggle ceases, because defeat leads to its expulsion. It is not so with social revolutions among nations who have long been in existence. Changes attack interests, interests form parties, parties enter into contests, and the more victory spreads, the greater grows opposition. This is what happened in France. The work of the Constituent Assembly perished less from its defects than from the attacks of faction. Placed between the aristocracy and the multitude, it was attacked by the one and invaded by the other. The latter would not have become sovereign had not civil war and the foreign coalition called for its intervention and aid. To defend the country, it became necessary that it should govern it. Then it effected its revolution, as the middle class had effected its own. It had its 14th of July, this is Bastille Day, in the 10th of August. Its Constituent Assembly, the Convention. Its government, which was the Committee of Public Safety, yet as we shall see, without emigration there would have been no republic. So in other words, you can think of Marx talking about the ascending line in the 18th Brumaire, the third chapter, that these different parties are representing different social interests. So again, this idea is coming to their mind. Now, by the mid-19th century, this idea of the third estate as some single political actor starts to become a problem for the historians of the class struggle. Now everybody's waking up, because now we're in the realm of Marxism, almost. Okay. Thus writes Francois Guizot in 1850, in the middle of the 1848 revolution. I love this quote. Whenever it shall have been distinctly perceived and fully admitted that the different classes which exist among us, and the political parties which correspond to those classes, are natural and deeply rooted elements of French society, a great step will have been made towards social peace. So if we were to recognize the classes of society, we'll be able to form the harmony of classes. Right, again, the idea of the harmony of classes is like this bourgeois idea. This peace is impossible so long as each of the different classes and the great political parties into which our society is divided cherishes the hope of annihilating the others and of reigning alone. That is the evil which, ever since 1789, has periodically agitated and convulsed France. Sometimes the democratic element has aimed at the extinction of the aristocratic. At other times, the aristocratic element has tried to crush the democratic and to regain its former predominance. Constitutions, laws, the administration of the government have been by turns directed like engines of war to one or the other of these ends, a war to the death, in which neither combatant believed his life compatible with that of the rival. So just skipping ahead a little bit, he talks about this war being suspended by Napoleon. He rallied around him all the classes. After him, from 1814 to 1830, and from 1830 to 1848, this war was renewed. A great progress had been made. Liberty had become real. Both the ancient aristocratic and the modern democratic elements acquired strength, but though neither could succeed in suppressing the other, each was impatient of its adversary's existence and eagerly strove for the mastery. And I want to call attention to this paragraph I'm about to read, because you might have heard democratic and thought he was talking about the proletariat. And now a third combatant has entered the arena. This is Guizot. The Democratic Party, having divided itself into two conflicting sections, the workmen are now arrayed against their masters, or the people against the middle classes. This new war, like the former, is a war to the death, for the new aspirant is as arrogant and exclusive as the others can have ever been. The sovereignty, it is said, belongs of right to the people only, and no rival, ancient or modern, noble or bourgeois, can be admitted to share it. Now, it's important that Guizot could not make sense of 1848. So he begins his preface to the history of the origin of government in Europe in 1851 by saying that France has been carried far away from the designs of 1789, the alliance of a free institution with hereditary monarchy. Right, that would have been the view then. His 1850 pamphlet that I was just quoting from was supposed to show that that Louis Philippe and Guizot's service under the July monarchy, so he becomes the Secretary of the Interior. So let me just step back for a second. Guizot is actually kind of banished from his position teaching. So during the Restoration, there is a period when there's like a assassination, Duc de Berry, and also they reveal that they're, I'm going to mispronounce this, Carbonari. Is that how you pronounce it? It's the Italian secret society plots. They kind of discover them.
Oh, Carbonari. Yeah.
Carbonari,
Yeah.
who I'll talk about a little bit more in a bit. That's discovered, and so it allows the conservative side, Chateaubriand, to kind of like press down on all sorts of things and press forward all sorts of like exclusions, all sorts of reactionary things. It plays to the side of the conservatives and ultras. Right, because it's discovering the assassination, obviously. The assassination, also, they can then say, see, this is all that the French Revolution ever was it was crimes against the Regency and things like that. So Guizot actually himself loses his position, and when he comes back at the end of the 1820s, if we want to talk about history and politics, it looks like his entire 6-volume history of France is coming true. Right, that the very force of history is leading to, you know, Louis Philippe replacing, it's Charles X? Is that right? It's Louis Philippe who comes to power, the July monarchy. It is, I think.
Yes, Louis
Yeah.
Philippe.
That was George XII.
George the 12th?
Charles the 12th. But it was
Charles the 12th? Okay, I always thought it was, all right. I thought it was Charles the 10th. Okay, I believe you. Totally believe you. It's after Louis the 18th dies, and then it's Charles. It's the 12th? I thought it was the 10th. Whatever. A Charles. And Louis Philippe basically replaces him, and it's the July monarchy. And again, it looks like Guizot is basically, has been on the right side of history. That in this period, he has written this whole 6-volume history of France, where he's saying, look, the representative system is coming. It's a necessity. It's a historical necessity. And so this idea coming out of the Restoration that to be effective in politics, and I'm talking about the liberal historians, one has to grasp the necessity of history. Obviously, this is there in Marxism, right? And this, of course, as I'm going to quote from Marx in a second, is what he's going to say, if you want to know where this idea comes from, it's by no means mine. Likewise, Thierry, in a letter in 1850, and Thierry is like deep to my heart, I'm sorry, everybody, I no longer understand the history of France. The present has turned upside down my ideas about the past, and with all the more reason, it has overturned my ideas about the future. I have lost my historical faith, and something which I would never have believed, my political faith, is sinking away. So he really goes kind of sad boy right there. Now it's funny, because I was quoting from his 1853 preface, and now we're getting into Marx. Let me just quote from Thierry. We'll be right into Marx. So he begins this amazing history of the Third Estate by saying, in order that the nature of the work may be perfectly understood, I must fix the true sense of the words Third Estate in the mind of the reader. The space which separates the present time from the old regime, and the prejudices which were spread by systems tending to divide the population of the nation, which is today one and the same, into classes mutually opposed to one another, have obscured in the minds of many persons the historical idea of that which constituted in former times the third order in the States General of the kingdom. So like Guizot and Thierry, they're saying this was not there at the time. There was a disposition to suppose that this third order then answered to what is now called the bourgeoisie, that it was a superior class among those which were out of the pale of it and in different degrees beneath the nobility and clergy. This opinion, which, besides its falseness, has the evil of making an antagonism appear to have its foundation in history, though it is in reality but an invention of yesterday, and one that is destructive of all public security, is in contradiction to all the ancient proofs, to the authentic acts of the monarchy, and to the spirit of the great movement of reform in 1789. In the 16th century, some foreign ambassadors, describing the political constitution of France, said, quote, "What are called the states of the kingdom consist of three orders of persons, who are first the clergy, next the nobility, then all the rest of the population. The third estate, which has no particular name, may be called the general one, the state of the people. The order of Louis XVI for the convocation of the last States General designated as having a right to be present at the electoral assemblies of the third estates all the inhabitants of the cities, boroughs, and rural districts, French by birth or naturalization, of the age of 25 years, having a fixed residence, or entered on the list of taxes. Lastly, at the same epoch, the author of a celebrated pamphlet, that everybody in this room knows, reckoning the number and maintaining the unity of the pleading order, threw out, as an utterance of the opinion which was almost universal, these three questions and answers. What is the third estate? Everything. What has it been hitherto in the political order? Nothing. What does it require to be something? Karl Marx himself wrote to Engels about this text. A book that has interested me greatly is Thierry's Histoire de la Formation et du Progrès du Third Estate. I'm just going to say that. 1853. That's what I've been quoting from. As Marx says, it is strange how this gentleman, the father of the class struggle in French historiography, inveighs in his preface against the moderns who, while also perceiving the antagonism between bourgeoisie and proletariat, purport to discover traces of such opposition as far back as the history of the Third Estate prior to 1789. He is at great pains to show how the Third Estate comprises all social ranks and estates, save the nobility and clergy, and that the bourgeoisie plays the role of representative of all these other elements. Here's Marx to Engels. Had Mr. Thierry read our stuff, he would know that the decisive opposition between bourgeoisie and people does not, of course, crystallize until the former seizes, as Third Estate, to oppose the clergy and the nobility. But as for the roots and history of an antagonism born yesterday, his book provides the best proof that the origin of the roots coincided with the origin of the Third Estate. And remember, if we think back to Guizot and Thierry talking about the historical nature of history, Marx is saying, shouldn't they recognize this about their own theory? By the same token, this otherwise intelligent critic would have to conclude from the Senatus Populis Romanas, I don't know how to pronounce it, that in Rome there was never any opposition save that between the Senate and the populace. Communism grew as the crisis of the French Revolution grew, as being reflected in its historians. For the French Revolution does not really end with the Restoration, but continues in the 19th century. In fact, when did it ever end? Auguste Blanqui's father was in the National Convention, and he had memory of the Restoration. He remembers, like, Prussian soldiers coming up a hill that he was in it. Even in 1848, Blanqui still saw the revolution as the continuation of the 1848 revolution. He and his older brother Adolphe moved to Paris in 1818. At that time, the, quote, acrimony of the conflict between nobility and bourgeoisie seeped through the walls of the schools. So he was hearing, you know, the histories of Thierry, Guizot, Adolphe Thiers, who I didn't mention, but is also a historian, later becomes the worst person ever in the Paris Commune, and also Francois Guizot. But also, Auguste Blanqui was encountering and hearing what we were talking about earlier, like the carbonery, right? The secret sex, the kind of Italian ones. And in fact, upon his graduation, he immediately associates with one of the sects. Philippe Buonarroti, I think that's how you pronounce it, who's from the same family as Michelangelo Buonarroti, so he's a descendant of that, had published his History of Babeuf's Conspiracy for Equality in 1828. In it, he presents Robespierre as the illustrious martyr of equality. For Buonarroti, Robespierre had not treated property as a principle right, but rather subordinated it to other rights. Same with Thomas Jefferson. Never forget, not a patrician. While Blanqui claimed in his old age, in 1879 to a London reporter, that he was not a disciple of Babeuf, Blanqui was clearly able to draw the continuity by treating the conspiracy of equals as the true history of the First Revolution. So in this kind of growing crisis of the memory of the First Revolution, you start to get also people saying, oh, actually the true Friends of Equality, this was like the manifesto of May 31st in 1793, right? This is the, like Robespierre, this is the Committee of Public Safety actually could have gone even further than it did. It looked like an emergency measure, but it might have been able to rehabilitate society as a whole, right? And of course, obviously, Babeuf as well. Did you want to say something?
When did Jefferson ever say that property rights were...
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness.
Subordinate needs of the state?
Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, yeah.
But that's why states are created.
No, it's subordinated to other rights. That's what I just quoted. To others. To other rights. That's there in the 1793 Declaration of Man that Robespierre writes, that Buonarroti cites in Babeuf. Yeah, right.
I just wasn't aware.
That you have a right to property so long as it doesn't infringe upon somebody else's existence.
I wasn't aware of Jefferson saying anything.
Well, that's what life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, that property is a means to an ends, as opposed to saying the, ends of the government is life, liberty, and property.
Well, that was actually Jefferson's original words.
He changed them. He changed them with Franklin.
Franklin, yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I don't know, everything in Jefferson is... Also, Jefferson has a hand in the French Declaration of Rights of Man. He has input.
Yes.
Right, yeah.
But there's also the Fifth Amendment, which says that property precedes government.
That's the bourgeois revolution, right? Because in order to have a representation in the political sphere, it presupposes who are the people.
Oh, but right is not identical with government.
Right.
Right? So,
Yeah.
of course, right precedes property and property precedes government. But right also precedes government. You have government, you have right before there's any government.
Yeah.
And government has to respect your right.
Yes, and one of those rights is property, as the Fifth Amendment.
Yes, but the right to freedom obviously precedes the right to property.
I don't even consider it the Fifth Amendment. I just consider it bourgeois right, the right to the fruits of your labor.
But the Fifth Amendment says that no one should be deprived of their
Yes.
property without due process.
Yes, that's the juridical conception that's putting a form to it, and even as you just said, in terms of due process.
Well,
There's also a question of right and law.
Do it. So like for instance, Queen Anne really famously in the 1710s went to the House of Commons and had this lawyer give a speech about how she had the right to take everyone's property from the House of Commons. Right. So this is like in the history of the struggle of the bourgeoisie with the aristocracy is, yes, the arbitrary confiscation of property.
Yeah.
They want that confiscation not to be arbitrary. But obviously there are rights that go beyond property. If your right to property is violating the rights, a more fundamental right of freedom, then of course you can have it.
The question is whether property is created by the state for the benefit of society.
No, for them it's not created by the state.
That's
and the same way,
Declaration of Rights of Man.
but it's created by...
No, it's not.
It's not created by the
also
state.
not. They just would say if it infringed upon it, but they don't say the state. Actually, not only did they not say the state, their language, even in the Declaration of Rights of Men, is sort of like deontological, that we're equal by nature.
I'll have to check it out.
Also, I'm pretty sure it's Charles X. Can you Google that?
I think you're...
For the record, it is Charles X. It was not the 12th. Okay. I was pretty sure about it. Okay. So, Blanqui comes to the fore as a young revolutionary in the July Revolution. Actually, one of the first speeches we have by him is in the memory of the death of Benjamin Constant. Here we see the revolutionary third estate has begun to look different. Quote, until now there have been three interests in France, that of the so-called upper classes, that of the middle and bourgeois class, and finally that of the people. This is Auguste Blanqui. Okay, I place the people last because they have always been the last, and because I can count on the imminent application of the gospel maxim, the last shall be first. At his defense trial just a month before the speech, Blanqui spoke of the, quote, proletarians like me. He was not a working class person, proletarians like me. After the 1830 charter, Blanqui felt that the tricolor flag was no longer the flag of the Republic, but had become the flag of what? It is Charles X, I have it written down, that presided over massacres in 1834. Okay, it is a canard that Blanqui is simply for a minority acting in lieu of the masses. You might know this from the history of Marxism. He is actually drawing a conclusion from Buonarroti's Babouf in the context of the July Revolution. In 1832, Blanqui tells the Society of Seasons that during the conflict of the bourgeoisie and the royalty from 1825-1830, the masses were indifferent to the debate. Following the previous French historians, the outcome of the struggle, the Charter of 1830, was itself the outcome of the class struggle of the bourgeoisie and monarchy. The absence of the masses is embodied in the very political institution of society. But Blanqui follows it even more. There are two principles in France that defined France at the time for him. The principle of legitimacy and the principle of popular sovereignty. The latter of which, quote, rallies all men of the future, the masses who, tired of being exploited, seek to smash the framework that suffocates them. The white flag raised by the middle classes was simply a false compromise. When Marx notes the farcical repetition of 1789 and 1848, this is not an astute observation on his part. He is voicing the revolutionaries himself. As Blanqui wrote from prison, so this was at a banquet, to the mountain of 1793, to the pure socialists, its true cares. It is this fixation that Marx was trying to bring into critical relief. The Buonarroti reading of the May 31st, 1793 Constitution and the Temporary Committee for Public Safety was that it was the democratic regeneration of the nation. And I got this a few minutes ago, so I might have to just skip what was going to be my dramatic read. How much time do I have?
Well, you've been going for an hour and a half, and I'm just worried we're not going to be able to have a discussion.
Okay.
So, people should, so that people can ask questions and things like that before they have to leave.
What are the things that, I'll just tell you what the last stuff that I had is, and then people can choose. So I was going to dramatically, in full detail, read Buonarroti's, just a section about the First Republic, basically, the Democratic Republic from Buonarroti's Babouf. But the point there, all that I really wanted to say, is that he basically presents the Committee of Public Safety as being unconsciously a model of potential regeneration and reform of the entire nation. That actually they had planned everything, they had set price limits on things, they had regulated trade. He talks about the regeneration of the French people because they identified, as he puts it, with government authority and legislation became every day more popular. And he's seen basically the extension. I know it was promised and then never actualized in Paris, but it would have been universal suffrage with no property requirements, that it led people to identify with authority and government, and that it was promising equality on earth, as he puts it. So all I'm trying to say is that there's this other subterranean history of the French Revolution that is becoming popular in the 1830s. Heinrich Heine apparently saw workers with copies of Buonarroti's Babouf. That's what is at least claimed. That's the apocryphal story in that case. And he talks about all the distribution of goods and everything like that. I don't have enough time to go into all the details and stuff, but for me, what Blanqui is following is this idea of the need for a revolutionary democratic dictatorship. And at the time of the 1839 insurrection, which Victor Hugo has a very funny, to me it's funny, little remembrance about it in Things Seen, where he talks about walking around Paris and he's like, I heard there's an insurrection, I can't find it. He just sees some soldiers, because it's like, they planned this whole insurrection with the Society of Seasons. And by the way, they're called the Society of Seasons because they had this order where everybody is in a month, and then in weeks, and then in days. So that's how they had their ranking, like I'm July 1st, and this is how you were ranked in these things. They planned this insurrection, and then literally people are looking on at it, and they're like, what the fuck is that? Like, just nobody cares or anything like that. So this is where I feel like we get this image of Blanquism is like a revolutionary conspiracy, whereas in Blanqui's view, I have to read this because this is from the document. I'm sorry. This is what was discovered when they were persecuting the Society of Seasons. It was written by Joseph Clouseau, I think. It's one of their young people they recruited to this secret organization. This is Samuel Bernstein's summary. The document put forward 4 questions. What revolutionary measures shall be taken? Shall the revolution be directed by a provisional dictatorship? Shall the body rule out the necessity, or shall it be sanctioned by the will of the nation? If the second, how long shall it remain in power? The answer is dovetailed. After the victory, I'm going to summarize this to jump ahead a little bit. Basically, they said that the people would be armed, and so that the revolutionary government would be supported by the masses. So the point is not supposed to be a minority against the masses or something like that. It's rather that that was what the effect was. That was kind of stunningly demonstrated in 1839. And it should be clear that also Blanqui develops his views throughout his lifetime. Meaning by 1848, he has more of an idea that you need a democratic organization. We famously know how the Paris Commune, that the Blanquists themselves operate in trade unions and things. But what we're getting from Blanqui is this idea of the proletarian revolutionary dictatorship. Again, he's calling himself a proletarian, that there's a necessity of a revolutionary dictatorship. They're gathering this from the history of like the kind of Buonarroti reading of the French Revolution. And they're saying this is why we've yet to be successful, because people have not been clear about this necessity. So that's coming from Blanqui. Okay, so the last 2 things I have is I was going to quote from LaSalle, and then I was going to talk about Marx and Engels, how they take it over. Maybe I can speed run this. Do you think I can speed run this? Or any questions so far?
Why don't you get to the end of the presentation and then...
Okay. The French Restoration historians already gave a history of the modes of production. For Francois Guizot, the history of civilization could be reduced to the development of social activity and that of individual activity, the progress of society and the progress of humanity. Consequently, social activity could come into contradiction with the intercourse of individuals or how they organize their social relations. It was not the contradiction of forces and relations of production, it was rather the succession of principles. The liability that we have today is that we repeat this kind of thought figure when it's actually become anachronistic. Let me give an example, and this is why I wanted to quote Ferdinand Lassalle. So this is Lassalle writing in the 1860s. We have now seen, gentlemen, 2 periods of the world, each of which is dominated by the ruling idea of a particular class of the community which impresses its own principle on all the social arrangements of its time. First, the idea of nobility, or of the possession of land, which forms the ruling principle of the Middle Ages and permeates all its institutions. This period closed with the French Revolution, although you will understand that, especially in Germany, where the change was not brought about by the people, but by very gradual and incomplete reforms introduced by the government, numerous and important extensions of that first history have occurred, which even at the present day greatly hamper the progress of the bourgeoisie. We saw in the next place the period of history which begins at the 18th century with the French Revolution, which has for its principle large private property, or capital, and makes this into the privilege which pervades all the arrangements of society and is the condition of participation in directing the will of the state and determining its aims. It's very Hegelian as well, speaking of principles succeeding one another. On the 24th of February 1848, the dawn of a new period of history appeared. For on that day in France, a revolution broke out which called a working man into the provisional government, declared that the object of the state was the improvement of the lot of the working classes, and proclaimed the universal and direct right to the suffrage by which every citizen who had attained his 21st year, without any reference to the amount of his property, received an equal share in the government of the state, in the direction of its will, and the determination of its aims. You see, gentlemen, that if the revolution of 1789 was the revolution of the third estate, the third class, it is now the fourth class, which will now raise its principle to being the dominating principle of the community and cause all its arrangements to be permeated by it. But here, in the domination of the fourth class, comes to light this immense difference, that the fourth class is the last and the outside of all, the disinterested class of the community, which sets up and can set up no further exclusive condition, either legal or actual, neither nobility nor landed possessions, nor possession of capital, which it could make into a new privilege and force upon the arrangements of society. We are all working men insofar as we have even the will to make ourselves useful in any community. This fourth class is whose heart, therefore, no germ of a new privilege is contained, is for this very reason synonymous with the whole human race. So I'll jump ahead a little bit. In other words, Lassalle is recapitulating the old bourgeois conception of classes. So he says that the fourth class has this principle of community, of doing away with all principles, but again, he has this kind of successive history. Whereas for Marx and Engels, the recrudescence of the class struggle that was being represented by the proletarian socialists was a consequence of self-contradiction. History had itself become self-contradictory. In his introduction to his critique of Hegel's philosophy of right, Marx describes the proletariat as, quote, the dissolution of society as a particular estate. The particular estate that Marx referred to was the third estate, or what J.C. Blanqui wrote, the whole concept of society has its natural basis in the customs and views of the third estate. It is not really a popular concept, but a third estate concept. What turned Blanqui's popular revolution into a coup de main was the growing contradiction of the political and economic spheres. This is obviously dropping out of both Blanqui and Lassalle. When Rosa Luxemburg writes that we will come to the power at the end of the revolution, when Lenin says in April 1917, we are not Blanquists, but we want the class-conscious workers to win the majority to their side, when Marx warns the Communist League in September 1815 that if the proletariat were to come to power, the measures it would introduce would be petty bourgeois and not directly proletariat. These revolutionaries are raising the specter of Blanqui to say that the task of pushing the contradiction to the point of grasping the historical character was not palpable yet. Marx's injunction in March of 1815 to push the Democrats, quote, to their logical extreme and to turn their proposals into direct attacks on private property was not a call for extreme democratic republicanism, but the path to the proletariat forming its, quote, independent political position. For the democratic attack on private property brings into sharp relief the contradiction of labor with itself, the rights of man and the rights of citizen. We were just talking about this a few seconds ago. These were codified in Napoleon's code as congruent, but have since become contradictory. This is why, even in power, it is essential for the class-conscious proletariat to have independence from the state, as Lenin rightfully criticized Trotsky in 1921. Communism was the real movement of history for Marx and Engels, not in the sense of progress, but because it was symptomatic of the problem of history. As Marx would write Arnold Ruge in 1843, when we get down to what communism is at its basis, it will then become plain that our task is not to draw a sharp mental line between past and future, but to complete the thought of the past. Lastly, it will become plain that mankind will not begin any new work, but will consciously bring about the completion of its old work. For Marx, both Thierry and Blanqui were right. It was wrong to project the proletarian class struggle onto the French Revolution. This is Plekhanov. The proletariat of that day did not possess the requisite capacity, nor did the means of production of that day meet with even the elementary requirements of socialization. Therefore, neither the proletariat of its time nor its most advanced representatives could even conceive of the idea of socialism. It is true that in pre-revolutionary French literature we find a few communist utopias, but these, for the reasons stated, could find neither currency nor recognition. Here's Lenin. No selfishness was therefore displayed at the time by the ideologists of the bourgeoisie. On the contrary, both in the West and in Russia, they quite sincerely believed in universal well-being and sincerely desired it. They sincerely did not see the contradictions in the system, partly could not see the contradictions which were growing out of serfdom. Furthermore, Marx agreed with the liberal criticism of the May 31st, 1793 Constitution. Here's Marx and the Holy Family. Robespierre and Saint-Just and their party fell because they confused the ancient realistic democratic commonwealth based on real slavery with the modern spiritualistic democratic representative state, which is based on emancipated slavery, bourgeois society. What a terrible illusion it is to have to recognize and sanction in the rights of man modern bourgeois society, the society of industry, of universal competition, of private interest freely pursuing its aims, of anarchy, of self-estranged natural and spiritual individuality, and at the same time to want afterwards to annul manifestations of the life of the society, in particular individuals, and simultaneously to want to model the political head of that society in the manner of antiquity, ! Likewise, Engels would soon write after, the French Revolution was the rise of democracy in Europe. Democracy is, this is Frederick Engels, as I take all forms of government to be, a contradiction in itself, an untruth, nothing but hypocrisy. Theology, as we Germans call it, at the bottom. Political liberty is sham liberty, the worst possible slavery. The appearance of liberty, and therefore the reality of servitude. Political equality is the same. Therefore, democracy, as well as every other form of government, must ultimately break to pieces. Hypocrisy cannot subsist. The contradiction hidden in it must come out. And we must either have regular slavery, that is undisguised despotism, or real liberty and real equality, that is communism. Both these consequences were brought out in the French Revolution. Napoleon established the first and Babeuf the second. The communist plot did not succeed because the then communism itself was of a very rough and superficial kind, and because, on the other hand, the public mind was not yet far enough advanced. Babeuf's communism arose out of the democracy of the first revolution. The second revolution of 1830 gave rise to another and a more powerful communism. During this time, 1834-1835, a new doctrine sprang up among the Republican working men. They saw that even after having succeeded in their democratic plans, they would continue the dupes of their more gifted and better educated leaders, and that their social condition, the cause of their political discontent, would not be any bettered by any political change whatsoever. They referred then to the history of the Great Revolution and eagerly seized upon Babeuf's communism. It therefore followed for Engels that the democratic movement in all civilized countries is, in the last analysis, striving for the political domination of the proletariat. It therefore presupposes that a proletariat exists, that a ruling bourgeoisie exists, that an industry exists which gives rise to the proletariat, and which has brought the bourgeoisie to power. It's not Adam Smith's manufacturing era. It's not possible in the 18th century. The end. These above passages were written before 1848. After the Spring of Nations, it would be realized in the worst way possible. As Engels writes Kautsky in 1889, this plebeian equality and fraternity, he's writing about Kautsky's works on the French Revolution, was necessarily a sheer dream at a time when it was a question of doing the exact opposite. And that, as always, the irony of history, this plebeian conception of the revolutionary watchwords became the most powerful lever for carrying into reality this opposite, bourgeois equality before the law and fraternity in exploitation. So I'm just going to stop there because I know we were running up against time. But I was going to end with quoting the end of Socialism, Utopian, Scientific, because it sets up the other two teachings that I have, where Engels says, out of this history comes the need for the doctrine of surplus value and the materialist conception of history. Meaning you really can't quite touch on Marx just through this, but you can get at, this is why it's one of these things about, classes as an expression of self-contradiction. That's where Marx is bringing in, say, the materialist conception of history, and also later, imminently, the critique of surplus value, of what it comes to mean. So if people had questions and thoughts on these kind of things, we can write up on the board.
Thanks, David.
Okay, yeah.
What questions do people have? I mean, part of what we wanted to do is have a sort of discussion, right? So everybody should feel free to participate.
Has anyone here read To the Finland Station?
Yeah.
By Emmett Wilson?
Mm-hmm.
There's a chapter on Babeuf, right? Yeah.
and on Guizot.
Yeah. Guizot's name dropped at the beginning of the manifesto. Yeah.
No, it's very good, very relevant.
It's one of these things where it's like, is Guizot responsible for somehow getting Marx kicked out of something?
Was he? Did Marx flee France?
I think so, and it might have been like a large order that he just said all of these revolutionaries, get rid of all of them. The reason I bring that up is, of course, Marx is very familiar with his histories, and so when they're seeing this pamphlet, they're basically seeing the bourgeoisie are losing, they're falling into senility because they actually cannot make sense of politics anymore.
Oh, the third estate is exploding.
Yeah. So consequently, and yet it's one of these things as well that the reason I bring up Blanqui, and I'm sure I could do this with some other people, like other communists, they're also seizing upon their histories to try to make sense of their predicament. Meaning, Blanqui is obviously, it doesn't have to necessarily be Thierry or Guizot's history, but it's just in the air of this idea of social interest, and these are the parties, and these are the institutions, and that's what's playing out. And even the history of the French Revolution, and so they're trying to make sense of what's happening post-1830. The class struggle for Engels and Rosa Luxemburg begins in 1831. That's when they link it. So it's happening right after the July Monarchy, which is a disappointment to everybody, including even Guizot. And so that's why his 1850 pamphlet he's basically saying, look, we could have saved it, we didn't need a revolution. Well, there's like corruption, obviously. Other thought? Yeah.
I have a certain question because I'm trying to like wrap my head around it. Maybe you could speak to if I'm on the wrong path here. But could we do something where we like say, okay, capitalism is to democracy as socialism is to liberty? First of all, does that way of thinking about it make sense? And if so, how could we think about it?
Capitalism is to democracy as socialism is to liberty. Well, could you say more? I mean, I guess liberty is also a word that can mean everything and anything.
Yeah, no, that was
like
just
in the American Socialist Party, they would say we want.
Yeah, no, that was more just like a placeholder. I guess the question is what will we put there? If it even makes sense to put something there, if that way of thinking about it even makes sense.
Internationalism, the rule of the international proletarian dictatorship.
Mm-hmm.
First of all, democracy is conceived of within the nation state. I mean, there's no conception of anything broader than that.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, Marxism is founded on internationalism, proletarian internationalism. And so the supersession, the overthrow of the nation state, is the establishment of an international democracy.
Mm-hmm. When I did so I did this presentation on Lenin in Berlin in January, and it came up just off of what Dan was saying. Like Lenin critiques Rosa Luxemburg. You know, they have this disagreement over the self-determination of nations. Mm-hmm. And he kind of plays on our words where Lenin says, only to the bourgeoisie is the nation state unpractical. Mm-hmm. Or proletarian nationalism is unpractical because the demands of proletarian democracy are constantly going to go through the borders of the nations. Mm-hmm. Right? I think I brought this up at this teaching I did in Philly where it's like, if you start saying, you know, if the proletariats start making claims on society, you kind of can't stop at the nation state. Mm-hmm. Right? In other words, I think I brought up Ghana and France and England. It's like, okay, who owns the property in Ghana? Is it just the workers in Ghana? No, it's also the French workers and the English workers, but likewise the workers in Ghana own the factories in France and England. So if you just follow the logic, this is kind of going, I think what Dan was saying, that it necessarily breaks through. That's why in the Communist Manifesto they say, in form it appears like a national revolution, but in substance it's not. Now obviously that's something that can be abused for all sorts of reasons, and that's why it's important to emphasize the contradictory character, as I was just saying, between the rights of man and the rights of citizen.
And also, do we need to go through democracy to arrive there in a similar sense?
Well, it it goes to the question of the proletariat as the vanguard of the democratic revolution. So it's not necessarily that one says democracy is good. The point is that democracy happens anyways. Right? Like this goes to our point regularly that Marx and Engels could presuppose a communist movement, which, as Engels says, nowadays is democracy, but really like that's what's driving it. But the point is it's already there. I think to your point, what happens is a lot of the left just take up democracy as a virtue and then miss the kind of point behind it. Right? Meaning democracy is on display all the time. It might even be on display in terms of the apathy of people. Go ahead.
Anyone else want to have a say?
Yeah.
Well, thank you.
Yeah.
So for me, it's my first time hearing about these topics, so I'm still trying to wrap my head around what happened. But I do have a question, trying to understand the idea that you mentioned that labor is saving civilization. How does that come to be? Because before there was a feudal system, and then labor came to give people rights in a certain sense.
So it's I was going to write something on the board, but maybe not. It's the way that Thierry and Guizot and other historians around them are basically saying that it can realize the far-reaching freedoms of different eras of human civilization. That Rome was able, under the kind of emperor system, to really perfect the kind of administration. But it was kind of, I think I quoted Thierry saying that your enemies were outside of the city. Whereas with labor, what's happening is you're getting the distinction between civil society and the political sphere. So in the French Napoleonic Code, they said the rights of man versus the rights of citizen. We were just talking about democracy. So if I go to another country, my rights as a human are respected, right? It's wrong to steal from me or beat the shit out of me in another country, but I'm not able to vote in another country. So there's a stratification between what it means to be a human and a citizen. So the point is, in Thierry's view, that in the cities, they were actually able to rehabilitate the old Roman administration, but it was more orderly and in a sense could be dispersed. So he talks about the different towns and hamlets imitating each other. So he literally says there's a bourgeois revolution in that the cities are being imitated all over. And it's not like a uniform thing, it's an admixture of things. And also over time, in the cities, the kind of hereditary nobility are sort of slowly pushed out. And pushed out sometimes violently as well in terms of struggle, so that the magistrates of the cities are elected, right? Before they were kind of assigned by the church, now they're being elected in that sense. So it's allowing for, in his view, that they can return to the old Roman administration. They can actually also realize the feudal era view of sovereignty, right? Because they're strong enough to be able to say that if we're conquered, we can fight them off or we can prevent being conquered, and also that we have a right to insurrection. They actually have it, a variety of cities. And so when I'm saying they have this kind of view of saving civilization, it's this idea that if it wasn't for that, humanity would have kind of remained dispersed in different feudal sovereignties. It would have been these rights, whatever Christianity promises about we're all equals, we kind of can't do that in practice. It's a nice view.
Okay.
You're aware of the and you're talking about a process that evolved from the mid 11th century to the late 18th. I mean,
am I aware of that?
Yeah.
I hope you think I'm aware of that. As I had just drawn on I hope you think I'm aware of that.
Yeah. Well,
it was a little Monty Python. I hope you're okay.
I mean, the Italian city-states starting in the 1050s developed these autonomous governing institutions.
But they were admixtured with all sorts of religious institutions.
They were fought. There were very complicated battles that were fought against the bishops in favor of the Pope.
I I was mentioning right at the beginning of the teaching, but I was running up against time, so I have to try to summarize Thierry's 2 volumes of the third study.
But the slogan was "City Year makes you free."
Right, that's a 14th century one.
Oh, it goes back even further.
Really? Okay, I thought it in German went back to 14th century.
Well, perhaps it does.
Yeah.
I'm not sure. I got Charles X wrong. But also the rediscovery of Roman law also occurs in the 11th century as well.
That's what Thierry is making reference to, yeah.
And so that actually becomes an instrument of bourgeois self-rule.
And it's presented, like, to Dan's point about the rediscovery, it's presented as ancient laws and customs that are the true, like, nature of law, or, you know, it's been buried for, I don't know, 1,000 years or something, or 500 years.
It's also rational rather than organic.
Well, yes, that right. But that's also why I mentioned the sovereignty aspect. So you have the aspect about rationality, but also he does say there's an element of feudalism that is carried over by the cities in terms of sovereignty, which are things that cannot be reduced to law.
I'm not sure what that means. I don't know what that means.
I think it has to do with a lot of, you know, these early bourgeois cities. Like, you could think of, like...
The right to fight.
Yeah, the right to defend yourself. You know, they would... there's some good examples, like in Catalan, or then also in the Spanish Empire even. There are these cities that exist kind of in between the centralized state bureaucratic machines. Where my husband's from, Quito, is one of those cities, right? It's both part of Colombia and it's part of Peru, the Viceroyalty of Colombia and the Viceroyalty of Peru. And so there's like a, you know, attempt basically to maintain a sort of like local autonomy against both. So there's, my sense is part of what they're talking about is that, you know, the emerging bourgeois society is kind of able to play the aristocrats and the absolutist state off against each other. They can take advantage actually of both of these things to try and create room for the freedom of society. And the way that this gets interpreted in the 19th century is that, well, what is it that the liberals in history do, or the people that we think are kind of our ancestors leading up to our ideology today? They repeal laws, they get rid of forms of coercion, and they used what was at their kind of disposal to do it, and through that they created representative government. How did they do that? By showing the necessity of balancing different powers against one another in order to limit state power.
Yeah. Well, but you're still telescoping a very long process. I mean, in the 11th century, there was a ruthless expulsion of aristocratic powers from cities like Genoa or Milan.
Oh, of course. I mean, but that's what they're doing in the 19th century. So just real quick, I'm not trying to give like, oh, this is my view of how the history goes. This is like what these socialists in the 19th century and the liberals as well are rediscovering, and how they're trying to interpret the meaning of that history in hindsight. So I agree. There's a lot of reversals. You know, some of these places just get destroyed. Like that's definitely the case in you know, the Spanish Empire, where I know the history a bit better. You know, like Siena, they've got some, you can go see some art from Siena right now from 1350, and then they all get the plague, and then they're basically conquered and the freedom's gone.
By Florence.
Yeah, and you know, Machiavelli has this idea too in his writings. You know, he imagines the world as a place that's like basically barbaric, and that you're trying to maintain liberty in this really small city where you live. And there are all of these obstacles to doing that. And it kind of, by the 19th century, it's reversed. And that's what Constant talks about in The Liberty of the Modern as opposed to the Ancients. He's like, well, now we're not tiny city-states. We're not kind of small groups trying to make our way in between these larger powers. We're massive nations that have been constituted. And so we don't have to go to war all the time. Right. We don't have to worry about constantly being invaded. We can assert our, you know, kind of self-governing power through commerce. So they did, like in the 19th century, they started relating to their history in a new way, and they gave themselves like a theory of history. And that, I think, is, Danny, what you were trying to kind of show, is that the class struggle as it emerged in the 19th century, that entire idea is actually a way for them to understand the history.
Obviously, of course, what is bourgeois society in like the 11th century or 12th century? It's like a castle. Like this is what Thierry is saying, right? It's basically a holdout that could be smashed at any time. A lot of them were and went away. Right, and so again, this kind of history of the burghers' class struggle is that they have fought all of these forces again and again and again, and in a sense, you really only get bourgeois society once it's no longer a few castles or city-states or something, that it's actually reproducing people's lives, that you have someone like a Benjamin Franklin, right, the Yankee-minded, Yankee-brained, that's what Marx calls him, who is just thinking in a bourgeois mode. And so then all of a sudden you can see these changes. You can actually reflect on the way in which, to quote Thierry, industry has changed things. So the telescoping, Thierry's point is that all history is telescoping. Because it's all trying to make sense of what matters in this, at least for him in the revolution, what does matter. So the cities that were just wiped out, they're just martyrs, maybe. Like they kind of don't matter. Right, we can't rely on them in the same way unless they've affected things that then play into the present.
That's why English history becomes so important. Because you have the history from the Magna Carta to the 17th and then the 18th century of what seems to be the development of an actual political form for bourgeois self-government through the Whig Party that then becomes representative government with separation of powers.
Can I quote Thierry about the sovereignty thing? The two great types of municipal constitution, the commune as such and the city ruled by consuls, both had insurrection in a more or less violent or contained form as their principle.
Yeah. But the overthrow of tyranny was a medieval political concept. And implicit in the idea of tyranny was the right to overthrow tyranny. Tyranny was unjust power, and therefore the right to resist tyranny, which is carried forward in the Second Amendment.
I'm just saying, to answer his question about how labor seems to be realizing all of these principles that maybe existed, maybe disassociated from them. This is at least his reading, and it's also Guizot's about them sort of being the medium. Because he emphasizes the rehabilitation of labor as if it's, obviously artisanal labor had existed in Rome and Greece, but it was kind of looked down upon in various different forms, right? And so its new value is allowing for these different ancient customs or forms or things like administration and sovereignty to be rehabilitated and regenerated. And so that's why I was making the claim that for Thierry, he's almost like, it saves civilization. Yeah, but yes, of course it's a long process because I mentioned Étienne Marcel. Right, so there's an early burgher who Thierry feels acted too much. He's like an early Robespierre is almost the way that he presents him, in his view. You know, he acts out when he shouldn't have. People are leaving in the middle of my teaching. I'm sorry, I'm a tough crowd.
No, Danny, it's been 2 hours.
I know.
Yeah.
Our reading groups are 3 hours.
I know, we usually teach-ins are 45 minutes so that we can talk. But,
okay. That's what, this is on the recording now, everybody. I'm gonna be like, my teachings always end with some funny, like, Seinfeld moment. Like, the last one ended with someone saying, let's go get tacos, and then that's on the recording. Okay, all right, thank you very much, everybody. This is good.